Welcome to the Struggle Bus Family Podcast, where we share real stories from the messy, beautiful, exhausting, and joyful world of caregiving. We're here to build a community that supports, educates, and uplifts caregivers and families of individuals with disabilities and complex needs. Whether you're a parent, sibling, educator, or just someone who loves a caregiver, there's a seat for you on this bus.
Welcome to the Struggle Bus family. We created this podcast because caregiving can be isolating, but it doesn't have to be. We believe that by sharing our stories, we create space for connection, healing, laughter, and maybe even a little hope. Hi, Johnny.
Hey, Jess, how are you doing today?
Doing well. I'm excited to dive into this topic. It's one I think a lot of families have questions about, maybe even some mixed feelings.
Yeah, I agree. So let's first start where we always do with the struggle, strive, or thrive. You want to?
That's easy this week for me.
Oh, then you go. You go.
So for the last probably week and a half or so, Avery has picked up this like screechy, kind of screaming, kind of just whining. But it's really annoying. It's really, really annoying. So this morning it started at like 7:15 and he did it through the time that he took a nap.
Which was what time?
12:30, 1 o'clock maybe. Yeah, so it's my struggle because I know that he's communicating and he understands that he's getting a reaction, but it is the most god awful sound in the world.
And, I've said before, though, negative attention is still satisfying that attention-seeking behavior itch, right? So,
Very true.
yeah.
Very true. And he definitely substantiates that claim. What about you?
Well, I'll say my strive I need to work on is patience. I've had the kids for 3 or so days myself, and for those that don't know, there's 5 of them, all with the ultra rare diagnosis of KDM5C. And just last night, my patience was like already hanging on by a thread. And Eric, for those that don't know, Eric will sometimes attack, for lack of a better term, his brother and scratch up his face and it can bleed. And he did that, and I just lost my shit.
I think last night he got both brothers. And somehow at the same time or right after, Avery managed to have a nosebleed from both nostrils.
Which I hope was unrelated to Eric.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's dig into today's topic, which is around defining intellectual ability. So, I think a good place to start is what even is intellectual disability?
Yeah, so the most clinical definition comes from DSM-5 that says intellectual disability means a significant limitation in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior before age 18, onset before age 18. It is usually tied to an IQ under 70 and issues with things like communication, self-care, and daily living.
Right. And the AAIDD basically says the same thing. But those definitions are really rigid. You have to meet both criteria, and you often go through standardized testing to even get the diagnosis.
Right, and I think that's where a lot of families, including my own, tend to get stuck. If your child doesn't meet some sort of technical, or I'll even say arbitrary threshold, or the evaluator or person administering the test, has a very narrow interpretation of what the how the scoring is, or how to interpret how the child responds, then you're not going to qualify for services. And that apply even if you need them, and that applies both at home and at school, right? I mean, because I assume most school districts are like ours, where they do their own independent testing as well.
Right. That's been our collective experience. We talked about this recently on our episode, The Golden Ticket. Sometimes it feels like you have to fight to prove your child needs support,
Yeah.
instead of the system recognizing that support needs come in all shapes.
I think, why don't we talk about that a bit more? So, these rigid definitions, how do you think they block access to services?
Well, first, they don't account for day to day functioning. A kid might test just above an IQ cutoff, but still struggle with decision making routines or safety.
Right, and I'll say that some disabilities are uneven, if you will. A child might be verbal but not necessarily independent, or might do okay in a school setting, but need help socially or emotionally, or with things like personal care things like toileting or feeding.
Exactly. And if you're only looking at test scores or the way a kid performs on a certain day, you can miss the bigger picture. And when that happens, you can lose access to Medicaid waivers, therapies, accommodations.
Yeah, and not just at home too, but at school, right? I mean,
Right.
so I think that maybe is a good segue to the label aspect of it. So what do you think labels do and don't tell us about a person or kids in this case?
Yeah, so this is tough for me because I come from a historical position of boycotting labels, right? Like I am anti-label. However, I actually think labels can help. They can validate what a family has been experiencing. And that was true for us. I mean, when we got our KDM5C diagnosis, um, and labels can open doors. So they can also be limiting. And I'll say like the easiest example for me is like the KDM5C diagnosis. It gave us a name for the thing that is causing so many different issues, but it doesn't qualify Avery for treatment. In fact, most physicians and people on his care team have never heard of it. And it's just like alphabet soup that they'll go look up, and they could have asked us and we could have answered it without them doing any research.
Yeah, I mean, on our care team, I won't say most, but I think all of the care providers had no clue about what it was.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, I'll also add though, once we did get that KDM5C label, um, to your point about opening doors, that's how we found a community of other KDM5C affected families, and it just opened not only a sense of community and belonging, but all sorts of doors open for just shared knowledge. Even though they're all individual, there's a lot of similarities. Um, but I think that to that point, that gives labels give people um, permission to understand what's happening. Or for us, kind of an easy way to explain, what our kids have or how or what's affecting them. Where we don't necessarily have to go into all the individual things, but it's like, oh, they have this, and it affects one out of every 30 or 32 million people. Um, but with being labeled, that also tends to be the only thing that people see with the kids, right?
Yeah, and the label doesn't tell you anything about their personality, humor, creativity, or joy. It doesn't tell you how hard a person works or what their family has learned through loving them.
So, what are some more inclusive or flexible ways um, that people can define intellectual disability?
So I really like this. The social model of disability really resonates with me. It says the problem isn't just in the person, it's in the barriers society puts in front of them. That shifts the focus to support access and inclusion instead of just a diagnosis. To summarize, disability is not just a medical issue. It's about social exclusion, inaccessible environments, and attitudes. People are disabled by society's failure to accommodate differences, not just by their bodies or minds. And this model calls for removing barriers, changing attitudes, and designing systems that and spaces to be inclusive of everyone. A medical model says a person can't walk,
Right.
so they're disabled. The social model says a person can't access a building because there's no ramp, and that's what disables them.
Right. I mean, and to that end, I think it's interesting that the UN Convention of Rights for Persons with Disabilities doesn't even give a fixed definition. Instead, it says disability is a result of interaction between people and their environment, or I'll rephrase and say people and the society they live in.
That's powerful. It means the environment has a responsibility to adapt also. Johnny and I discussed this last week or so when we were talking about the mission, vision, and values of the for the SBF community.
And I think, in terms of what that means for society, it's, I mean, it's simple, but it's not, right? I mean, if I look at other kids at school, so we have 5 kids across high school, middle school, and elementary school, and as a result, they have other peers with disabilities, but also um, many peers that don't have any disabilities, or that we know of at least. They're neurotypical. They're not in a special education setting, and with some exception, these kids, are generally accepting of our kids and understand that, okay, since we've already talked about Eric, Eric might need, help getting from one class, since he's in middle school now and they have, different class periods. It's not one classroom setting all day like elementary school. Eric may need help getting from or navigating the hallways from one classroom to another. Um, and they, he can get there, but he might need to know, like, okay, remember, go this way versus that way, those sorts of things. And these kids, will help him. His peers will help him. Um, whereas, I'll say my experience as an adult in society, um, people my age, my peers, my neurotypical peers, don't necessarily don't necessarily recognize or accept or acknowledge the fact that I might need, I don't even consider myself disabled, but that I might need help navigating the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I hope I'm conveying what I'm trying to convey, in that, I think it's, from a society perspective, it's not not having any preconceived ideas about, what a person can or can't do, or more specifically or important, how they go about navigating the world and do the things that perhaps the rest of us take for granted. They, like in Eric's case, he can do it, but he does it in a different way and might need some assistance, along the way there. So,
Yeah. And I think the more social definition for this allows us to not compare ourselves with each other or with someone who has a disability, but it offers the same experience, which is something we talked about in our episode with Bethany. And Bethany talked about creating inclusive environments and providing inclusive activities. And it's not that our kids or adults out there will have the same experience. It's you're giving them the opportunity to have the same experience. And I think that is a huge call out for society as a whole, because sometimes, like the example I gave, it's just as simple as installing a ramp so that someone can access a building. Um, I'm trying to think of another example of what that might look like, but, or, handicap restrooms. So if you're in a wheelchair, you can get in a restroom stall if you're able to use the restroom.
or I'm thinking, crosswalks, where instead of pushing the button and it says walk or don't walk, you'll hear that kind of one side beeps and then the other side beeps. So someone who can't see or is visually impaired can, know which way to navigate.
And I think it forces a mind shift for those of us who don't necessarily need like ADA type tools or resources to access things, or to be able to see, feel, hear, do whatever. um but at the same time, like, we can probably use those kind of cues too. So instead of like comparing ourselves or complaining because there's something extra, what we would consider extra, because right, the idea would be that it's not just extra, it's there. um but that we either learn to utilize some of those tools and resources, or we just appreciate the fact that they're there so that we provide more opportunity.
Right, and not to call up Bethany again, but it was a really fantastic episode. So you guys should definitely go back and watch that. But something else I remember something else she said in that episode where we're talking about kids specifically, in that you know making or building inclusive communities or environments benefits all kids, not just the ones that have disabilities. So I guess to try and wrap this up, what's something you'd want other parents or caregivers to take away from this discussion?
I think the big thing is, don't let a rigid definition tell you what your child is or isn't capable of. You know them best, and you have every right to push for what they need. And this is true for any diagnosis. Autism fits the profile for the need, because when you know one kid with autism, you know one kid. And we have manuals and guidelines and things that can tell us what we might expect, but the best thing we can do is see our kids and friends and others out there for who they are, and not like place upon them some presupposed idea of how much they can do or what they can't do. Or if they're intellectually disabled, then that means they have to have an IQ of less than 70. No, I look at our kids often and I think intellectual disability, because sometimes they know so many things. Our kids are really smart. They're very mischievous, they're very smart, and they have qualities that I don't think people would associate with intellectual disability. But at the same time, I look at Avery and I think, well, he's been in preschool for a year and a half, and he probably can't point out any letter of the alphabet or any number. Um, but does that make him unintelligent? No. It just means that he learns differently, and maybe he retains some things over other things. And, it's kind of TBD on the rest of it. But I think isn't it Albert Einstein who said, you can't judge a fish by its ability to walk or speak or something. Anyway,
Swim?
because
I don't know.
to climb a tree.
Okay.
You can't judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, because fish swim. So I think the same applies to all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think just because a label may help you or your child get access to services, by no means does that define them.
Right.
They are so much more than the label, right?
Yep. Agreed. If this conversation brought anything up for you, or you have your own story about navigating labels and services, we'd love to hear it. Reach out on our Facebook page or message us directly.
Right. And if you haven't already yet, follow us on YouTube, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you consume your content from. And thanks for riding the bus with us today. See
See
you
you
next
next
time.
time.